Welcome along, Brian Anderson. Brian is Glasgow born. He was still at school when the tragic ice cream wars arson attack took place back in 1984, which led to the deaths of 6 members of the Doyle family in Rochese. And, you know, as part of his incredible career as a photojournalist, Brian has rubbed shoulders with crime lords and foot soldiers, not just here in Scotland, but throughout the UK and further afield. In a strange twist of fate, Brian was actually a neighbour who witnessed firsthand, certainly could hear the awful aftermath of that arson attack that I spoke of a moment ago. And he went on, as part of his incredible career, to photograph a number of people who had been suspected, not proven, but suspected of having had an involvement of those attacks, as well as many, many others. Brian, welcome along to talk to us about your career, which spans almost 40 years. And I understand that you're involved in, first of all, a new publication, a documentary. Do you want to tell me about those?
Hi, John. Thanks for having me. So basically, it's basically a kind of a brand new crime magazine, and it's called Crime Zone, and it's a rebrand of an old project called Glasgow Eyes. And you know, I've been getting a lot of messages from people who basically want it kind of more crime. They're interested in true crime, so I'm going to be rebranding the magazine. It comes out tomorrow at some point, and it'll be UK wide, and it'll be known as Crime Zone.
Good. And Brian, I mentioned earlier, and I hadn't realised this until we spoke just a couple of days ago, I've been well aware of your career. I mean, your photographs are absolutely astounding. They're of the highest quality, and also you're managing to get in behind the scenes where no other person has been able to reach, as it were. You're kind of like the Heineken of street photography. In that respect, very serious subject matter.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you photographed a number of people who became part of the story, rightly or wrongly, relating to the arson attack that led to the deaths of 6 members of the Doyle family, and you had a kind of personal experience of that, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, basically, John, our family stayed in Bank End Street in Rochese. So this was, as you say, 1984. So we were, I was back visiting the street yesterday as part of a documentary, a kind of BBC documentary, and that was the first time I'd been back there for 40 years. And I didn't realise how tiny the street was. I mean, it was really small, you know, looking back. At the time, you're thinking it's obviously big, but I just couldn't believe how small it was. So, but we stayed at I think it was 53 or something. We were at one end, and basically the Doyle family was maybe 6 closes away from us. So obviously it was like a stone's throw, really stone's throw away. And basically on that terrible night, you know, my memories were basically, you know, waking up with the sound of smashing glass. I can always remember the smashing glass, and the commotion, voices, followed by howling screams. I can always remember the screams, like really haunting screams. I didn't realise at the time that obviously what had happened. I kind of went back to sleep and then woke up again, possibly, you know, minutes later again. I just thought it was a party. You know, I just thought, you know, in the East End, you know, it's quite common that you would hear a lot of kind of trouble at parties, and you just thinking it was a drunken party somewhere. It was only kind of, you know, minutes later that basically people were starting to kind of look at their backs, and we ended up coming to the verandas. So by that time, everybody's in the verandas. And I think our parents stopped us thinking, we kind of got to the bottom of the kind of street, and then we couldn't get much further because by that time, police and ambulances were on the road, and but what a shocking situation, you know. Didn't really realise the extent of what had happened until would have been days later, you know, when it started to kind of filter into the national press. But what an episode, and you know, what a tragedy for that family, John.
And did you know any members of the Doyle family?
Yeah, we obviously we knew them. It was, as I say, it was a kind of, you know, tight. Everybody knew each other, tight, you know, community, and basically we knew, obviously knew of them, of you know, different members of the family. But we were particularly partly with Tony Doyle, who died, and we had, you know, as youngsters back then, you know, we all kind of tend to kind of, you know, be with each other and hang about with each other. We played football with Tony as well. So yeah, definitely knew Tony. Yeah, I would have been 14 at the time, 13 going on to 14.
That's a terrible thing to. I mean, obviously, it was particularly tragic for any surviving relatives of the Doyle family and friends. And you obviously were, as you say, friends with Anthony Doyle, who was, what, 14 or something at that
14,
point?
14, yeah.
That must have been particularly traumatic for you. Was it something that you put behind you, or is it something that you've lived with ever since then?
I've never really spoke about that, you know, side of my life, because the last thing the family want to hear is somebody else talking about it. But basically, it was, I can only imagine for the family. I mean, I can't even imagine, you know, how awful that was. But for me, it's only, you know, probably during anniversaries that kind of, you kind of start thinking again about you know, us that night, you know, kind of, you know, witnessing a lot of that. And that's kind of when it hits home, you know, different anniversaries, and obviously when it starts appearing in the press again. Yeah.
I think when we spoke, you said that you occasionally still have flashbacks of that night.
Yeah, because obviously you're thinking, you know, for me, you're particularly thinking of the family, being everybody in the street, you know, being out there, particularly hearing the voices, you know, the kind of haunting. I can always remember that sticks with me. It was you know, remembering the, you know, hearing the howling voices, you know, the kind of screams that was, and to this day that is, you always think back to that, and that event.
You say it was haunting.
Yeah, hearing the. Because I thought I was dreaming. You know, you wake up and you're dreaming, and then you think it was because you're still quite, you're not quite kind of, you know, at that point you're fully awake, but then you're thinking, is it a party? And as I say, I went back to sleep, but then obviously the screams get louder, and so I cannot, that does. I've always kind of lived with hearing those screams. Yeah, it's terrible.
Does it concern you that you went back to sleep, or in a way?
I went back to sleep for a minute, and then we got woke up with it. Yeah, we got woke up. Everybody got woke up by that time, as I said. But we ended up, everybody was on the bottom of the road. You know.
Now you went on to become a photographer. You know, obviously years later.
Yeah.
But not many years later.
I picked up the camera in 1988, John. Just basically going along to a local camera club. And that's kind of how the kind of photography bug for me started.
And you've become a published author of your photographs. You've got your own magazine. You've worked for many top publications. You've had access to, you know, some incredible parts of the underworld fraternity. And as part of that, you've spoken to several of the protagonists, antagonists, or suspects relating to the ice cream wars, and you've photographed them as well. You've documented them.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about those people?
Just again, working for a national newspaper at the time, we ended up in various interviews. Some of the names would have been guys like T.C. Campbell. T.C. Campbell, over the years, would have been photographs at T.C., different interviews on, you know, various things, whether it's documentaries, books, or as you say, magazines. Joe Steele himself. So Joe, so these guys were wrongly accused of that.
Obviously, you're photographing these people. They're not your normal run-of-the-mill people. They live a different kind of life.
Yeah.
And obviously, some of them were suspected of having an involvement in these ice cream wars. Did that bother you at all? Did you speak to them about it?
No, it's not the kind of thing you ask individuals, you know, 'cause they're telling a story at the time, and that's really, you know, for me to just turn up and take photographs. I didn't really get involved in a lot of the dialogue, really. Okay, you've got your opinions, and you know whether things happen or what didn't happen back then, but it's just normally for me it's just the photographic side of things, John.
Joe Steele and T.C. Campbell, they were involved in the miscarriage of justice. Is that right?
Yeah, they basically, I think it was 10 years they served, and then there was obviously that ongoing situation where there was appeals and various things, and I first photographed Joe probably would have been in the late 90s, as well as TC would have been the kind of mid to late 90s when they were getting released. Obviously, they got released on the appeals. That's kind of when I first photographed both of those two, and then later on, when I was involved in a couple of books, photographic books based on the kind of criminals or former criminals. It was called Faces of the Underworld, and it was telling a lot of these stories through pictures, which was a bit different then. That book was a bit, rather than your books that have been written on certain subjects. These were the purpose of that book was basically telling the story of crime through photographs, which was just a different format.
Did any of those characters discuss their infamy, if you like?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, obviously, as we've done before in the past, Gary Moore was. I remember Gary Moore used to. I was with him for 3 days. Gary, I think Gary was one of the first ones arrested, if I can remember. But he was. He ended up turning up at the photo shoot with a loaded Magnum, which he was waving about in George Square, which I found to be bizarre. He was wanting to shoot the pigeons at one stage, which was a bit unhinged at the time, to say the least. So my memories of Gary Moore were quite strong.
Did you fear for your safety at any point?
Don't really fear for your safety, but obviously an accident could happen at any time if somebody's waving a loaded Magnum. So I think in the end we myself and the picture editor ended up wrestling a gun off Gary in a studio when we were trying to get studio photographs because he was waving the gun, and we're just thinking this is not how I want to die. I think it's time to rein him in and get this gun, and basically we had to literally wrestle the gun.
I hope you were well
things
paid.
Like that could have been an accident, yeah.
I hope you were well paid for that job. Was there danger money involved?
To this day, I can't believe how anybody would turn up. I mean, I think that kind of brought it home to me, John. Really, that night, that walking the streets of this city, you really need to be really careful because you could bump into the wrong person at the wrong time, and somebody could pull out a Magnum. I mean, it's just bizarre.
Why do these criminals or alleged criminals allow you to get into their inner sanctum, as it were? Is it that their ego demands some recognition, or
I think it is a bit of that, John. I definitely think when we done the Faces book, a lot of it was ego. I think a lot of it was they don't want to be forgot about in history. A lot of it was that it's like the newspaper side of things. Obviously, these guys were obviously giving interviews or they were in the news at the time. But my personal experience with Faces was basically a lot of these guys basically just didn't want to be forgot about, and it was just it simply just came down to ego. Yeah.
And would that include the licensee McGraw and
Well, again, McGraw was part of a newspaper. Was part of a newspaper assignment, and also his picture appeared on his front cover. So that appeared on the front cover of the Crime Lord book, which was written by Dave Leslie. And I remember turning up at the door. Chapping the door, and I had my studio light, and I always remember McGraw coming to the door, and I think this was the first time I'd ever met him. I'd photographed him like from distances and things like that, but this is the first time I was actually confronting him at the door. Not confronting him, but just appearing at the door, and he said to me, "What's in the bag?" And I just joked. I just said it's a bazooka, and he went, "That's okay, in you come." So that was my memory of meeting him.
Oh, strange meeting him, considering he was suspected of.
He wasn't liked in the city. He wasn't liked in the kind of Glasgow underworld.
Why was that, do you think?
He was called the licensee, and I think basically he was called that because he was informing on other criminals. So obviously, I think it's kind of common knowledge, like kind of X amount of years on that that was the case.
Were you aware at that time that he had been suspected of having been involved in the arson attack on the Doyle?
Yeah, I think his name is always in the frame, as for that. Yeah, as I say, but myself personally,
have you mixed emotions?
Kind of. I mean, obviously you've got a job to do. You're there personally. I'm employed by a newspaper to turn up and get some photographs. So it's. But there is that in the back of your mind, and you're always asking the question. I suppose You
have a new magazine coming out and a documentary coming out. Tell me about those.
Well, the magazine's called Crime Zone, and it's a rebrand of Glasgow Eyes. Glasgow Eyes has been running on and off in different formats for 10 years. But the rebrand is basically based on the amount of messages I get, basically wanting people interested in crime, true crime, reading about like nostalgic true crime, old crime, and I just figured basically it was time to make the magazine UK wide, and then just put it out as a kind of like similar to kind of Vice, like a British Vice, and that's the idea, and that kind of comes out tomorrow, John. It's like the first issue, so it kind of lands, it kind of goes live tomorrow morning.
And the BBC documentary?
Well, there's basically that was an interview I'd done based on a series that's coming out, which is they're looking at Glasgow kind of crime in general, and they were just interviewing me based on basically as a press photographer in the city during a lot of the kind of situations. So that I don't know when that comes out, but that's and there's talk about a documentary about myself possibly in the pipeline. So that's something I'll be able to talk about more like kind of later on.